All right, I want to take this opportunity to talk to you about navigation and menu arrangement. Photoshop is a highly customizable program, and it's designed to work on everything from 17-inch laptop screens all the way up to 30-inch desktop screens and everything in between. There are a lot of different resolutions that people use on their screen for Photoshop, and that just means that you're going to have different sizes when it comes to the space you have and working with the different menus. I'm recording this on a very low resolution setting simply because I want to save real estate on these videos, but also it gives you an idea of how small the screen can actually be when you look at the resolution that I'm using here. It's very cramped, it's very cozy here, but it should get the job done thanks to the customizable panels that Photoshop has come up with. So let's start off by saying that I've already opened a file. This is the Bali pot file, which you're going to find in the module 2 folder. So if you don't already have it open, here's the way you should be opening files in Photoshop. Simply go to the File menu, choose Open, and then navigate your way, whether you're on a Mac or a PC, to the folder that you're going to be working from. Now, here's the Bali pot file along with the other videos. Now, I just want to take this moment to remind you that these videos are designed to be played off of your main hard drive, not off the DVD. You're going to find that you get much better performance results when you play these back off of your hard drive. So please copy these folders over to your hard drive before you start working on them. And the same goes with files like this Photoshop file, which I'm about to open, the balipotfile.psd. So once you've located that Photoshop file, the PSD file here, you're going to simply choose Open, and there you go. So now you're hopefully looking at the same image I am. Now, what you may not be looking at is the same exact interface that I've got around the image. In fact, it may be very different from what I've got. So let's talk a little bit about the way Photoshop looks and how you can customize that. First off, I'm using Photoshop CS6. And if you're using an earlier version of Photoshop, and I've covered this on the Photoshop versions tutorial, but yeah, you can use a lot of different types of CS software, and so yours may look vastly different than mine. That's okay, because you're going to find that the panels and the menus are more or less the same, despite some minor enhancements and minor image changes that they've gone through over the years. So you'll notice, for example, that my basics are going to be similar to your basics. I've got a tool panel here on the left. I've got the options panel here on the top. And then I've got several other panels here on the right, including layers, which happens to be one of the most important things we're going to be using in this class in Photoshop. Now, before I get into the window panel, which is going to be significant for this, I just want to briefly point out, for Photoshop CS6 users, if you go to Preferences and you go to Interface, you do have the ability to change the theme of the background, okay? Now, you don't have this in other versions of Photoshop. You have other adjustments you can make, but this is a little bit different. You can make this look like older versions of Photoshop by doing something like this, where going to a lighter shade of gray. Now, some people like the fact that it's brighter. Some people find that distracting, and which is why they came up with the darker interface to kind of put the emphasis more on the photos. So it's up to you as to what you like. I'll let you pick and choose. But suffice it to say, if you're using an older version of Photoshop like CS3 or CS4, yours is going to be a lighter shade of gray. It's not a big deal though. Don't panic. You'll be fine. Okay, let's get into these different panels and how to configure them. First off, the main thing we're going to talk about here is the window menu. And when you click on that, you're going to see a lot of different options. I just want to direct your attention here to the middle part, which is the largest section. This has a listing of all the different panels in Photoshop. Okay, so I'm referring to these over here: swatches, color, adjustments, styles, layers, channels, paths. And a lot of people will accidentally close these out. They'll drag something over, they'll accidentally get rid of it because they needed space at the time, they weren't thinking, and then they panic because they can't get it back. Well, it's real simple. Window, say for example here I got rid of layers, so I'll bring back layers, and there it is. So anytime you lose a panel or a menu, this should be your go-to place, window, okay? Now, if you lose something other than these panels over here, say for example, the tools on the left, this is where you're going to bring it back. So here I've gotten rid of the tools, window, tools, and here they come back. Okay. Options, this is the option bar at the top, which coincides with the tools. Every time you click on a tool, this option bar will change according to that tool that you have selected. And you'll see me use this option bar from time to time during the lessons. But again, you can bring that, you can make it go away if you need more space for some reason, if you're using a laptop, for example, and then you can make it come back. For you beginning users out there, I don't recommend collapsing things too often. Just keep things simple. Just keep the stuff open that you're going to need. We'll talk about customization options in a moment. The application frame refers to this background area. So you notice when I got rid of the application frame, I now have what we call a floating window. And this looks like the typical window you would see in your system. I happen to be using a Mac, so it looks like a Mac. But if you have a PC, it'll look like your system standard PC window. Now, some people like that because they're more used to it. But I find that the application frame makes a more cohesive work environment. It just keeps things cleaner. And I kind of like the fact the windows snap to it and everything. So it's just up to whatever fits you the best. All right, now speaking of floating windows, you notice I pulled this layers panel out from what we call a nested group. So for example, if I drag this back, I can see different options. Like you notice this blue bar gets highlighted. I can drag it further over here and I get another blue highlight over here. I can bring it up here. And as you drag this around slowly, you'll start to see different blue little lights kind of come on. And if you're using an older version of Photoshop, it may look different. It's probably not blue, but you get the idea. You'll be able to nest these into different areas. What we mean by nesting is that when you see those little highlighted areas, that means that you can embed that window, that menu into that window space, that area. So try that out, see if it works for you. And again, this is a way that you can customize your workspace a little bit. Now, as you float windows around, saying things like this, let's say I was working with it over here because I liked it for a while, but then things get really confusing and you start to get really off base and you've closed things out and things are getting a little bit messy. The easiest thing to do is come to Window and go to Workspace and then go to Reset Essentials. Okay, when you go to Reset Essentials, it puts everything back to its default state just as it was when you first opened Photoshop. So for example, now if you find that your interface is a bit messy and it doesn't match what I'm doing, you may want to do that right now just to reset it, just to get back to that default workspace when you first installed Photoshop, just to bring things back to normal. All right. You'll also notice under Workspace, there's a lot of different categories, 3D, photography. When you click on these, different panels will come up to help you go with that particular workflow, whether it's editing photos or working in 3D space or working with videos, whatever. It's basically designed to help you in those particular categories. Okay, I'm going to go back to Essentials because that's the most basic layout that works for most people. All right, a couple things you can do. You can, first off, this tool column. Some people like to use this tool column in a double column view, and you can do that by hitting these little arrows at the top. The earlier versions of Photoshop always came this way, and then they switched to a single column to make more space for the photo. It's up to you as to what you like. Again, it's just a customizable thing. One last thing on customizing space is that if you do find that you like a particular arrangement, okay, let's say I bring this out and I put it on nested here on the left as opposed to the right. And I start building certain columns over here. Maybe I like all my colors to be on the left for some reason, and when in the photo in the center. You can customize the workspace. So you can go to Window and you can go to Workspace, and then you can go here. I've already customized a couple and I've saved them out. But you can actually make your own customized workspace anytime you want. You just go to Workspace, New Workspace, and you give it a name, and you can choose here to capture, to go ahead and save out the keyboard shortcuts and menus as well. But let's go ahead and just say, okay, give it a name. And save that out. And now you'll notice when I come up to Window, Workspace, that new one is now saved. It's worked out. Okay, so if I go to Essentials, and I want to reset this actually. Let's go to Reset Essentials. There we go. Back to the default space. And now if I go to Chris's color space, that Photoshop now remembers where I put those menus. So everything's back to normal, the way it was. Now, one thing that may confuse people is that why doesn't it go, say for example, if I go to Window, Workspace, and then I go to something, like Essentials Default, you notice it snaps back to where it was. But what if I do this? I pull this out and I go Workspace, Essentials, and nothing happens. Why is that? Well, Photoshop watches what you do. And so as far as Photoshop's concerned, this is the essential state. So it's going to stay that way until you move it or until you go back to Workspace, Reset Essentials. So if you need to go back to the default workspace, that's the place to do it. Okay, hopefully that clears things up in terms of menus and layouts and the different things you can do in Photoshop with that. Next up, I want to talk about navigation. Okay. Now that we've got an image open, it's important to understand how to navigate with that image. So first off, we should talk a little bit about the navigator. And there's a window for that. If you go to Window, Navigator. Now, depending on what version of Photoshop you have installed, that may already be open for you over here on the right. If it's not, like in Photoshop CS6, then go ahead and just go to Window, Navigator. It'll bring up this little panel, and what this is, essentially, it's a little zoom panel. You can zoom in on your photo, you can zoom out, and you can take, when you are zoomed in, you get this little red rectangle, which you can move around with a little hand tool and focus on a particular part of the photograph. It will tell you over here the percentage in which you're zoomed in. If you want to do this numerically, you can say, for example, I want to zoom in to 200%. There you go. Some standards you should know about when it comes to looking at your image. When you look at an image at 100%, okay? Now, even though I'm not seeing the entire photograph, this is the most naturally you can view a photograph. So when it comes to image editing, people will often want to go back and view their image at 100% so they can see exactly how sharp their image is. If you're doing sharpening, if you're doing adjustments, then you need to see the pixels in their native state, and that's what 100% will give you. Okay, so anytime you zoom in beyond 100% or zoom out, you may say, for example, here at 50%, I can see the entire photograph. So you might assume, okay, that's the native state. Well, no, it's not, because I'm going to start seeing some banding. I'm going to start seeing some stair stepping, and I'll see some things that do not represent the pixels as they will actually print. This is the closest we can get to viewing an image as it will print by viewing it at 100%. Of course, the drawback with that is depending on the screen size you're working at. Again, I'm working at a low resolution, but if you're working at a higher resolution, you may be able to view this image at 100% full screen, full image. It just depends on the resolution you have on your monitor. But a lot of times with high resolution images, these are low resolution images, so a little bit easier. But if you're dealing with images, there'll be a separate lesson on tutorials later, separate lesson on resolution later in the tutorials. But you should just realize that the larger the resolution, the more difficult it's going to be to fit the image on the screen, the farther you're going to have to zoom out to see it on the screen in its entirety. But keep that 100% number in mind as you start to navigate. All right, I'm going to collapse this by hitting the arrow there. I didn't mention this earlier, but these little panels here on the right are just sort of mini collapsed panels, this little shelf here. And anytime, if you know what these icons mean, like you see the little sailor's navigation wheel for navigator, here you've got the one for histogram, and so on and so forth. If you know what these icons mean, then it can be a handy little shortcut for you. But if you don't worry. You can always just rely on the names right here in Windows. So if I ever say, okay, bring up the histogram, you don't have to know that that icon is the histogram. You can simply go Window, Histogram, and it will pop up for you. So there's a lot of ways in Photoshop to do the same thing. All right, another way you can navigate without the navigator is to use this number way down here in the bottom left corner. That by default is set to the visibility number. So I can type in 100% here. Whoops, let me just get in a 100, hit enter or hit return on the keyboard, and now it puts me to 100% without using the navigators. Another way to do the same thing. The magnifying glass, which is located on your tool palette, will also zoom in or zoom out for you. If you hold down the Alt key or the Option key on your keyboard, you can zoom out by clicking. Notice the little minus sign on the magnifying icon. There's the plus symbol by default. Just use that Option or Alt key. Okay, now a keyboard shortcut that you should memorize in Photoshop. Now I don't get too deep into keyboard shortcuts. Some people love them, some people hate them. But if you want to work faster in Photoshop, I highly recommend remembering the Command key on your keyboard. That's the keyboard, the button next to your space bar. If you're using an Apple machine that doesn't have the word Command on it, then that's the key with the little Apple symbol on it. But if you're using a PC or a newer Mac, it'll say Command on there. It's the key directly next to the space bar on either side of the space bar. Hold it down and then hit the plus symbol on the keyboard to zoom in, minus symbol to zoom out. Very handy keyboard shortcut for navigating. The other thing you should know for keyboard shortcuts, since we're on the topic, hold down the space bar to turn into the grabber or the hand tool. That allows you to move to a particular location when you're zoomed in to an image. You notice I can even throw it, to click it and drag it, and it just sort of drifts. And that's kind of a thing they integrated into Photoshop within the last several versions. So kind of fun. All right. There are some shortcuts when you have the magnifying glass tool selected, and here's an example of how to use this options bar up here. You'll notice that they have some buttons built in for you. Say, for example, you want to fit it to the screen, or you want to go into print size. This will show you when you go to print size, it'll zoom automatically to 100% if you forget the number, but most people have no trouble remembering it. Actual pixels will do the same thing. Fit to screen if you want to fit the image in so that it fits. So you get the idea. These are just little buttons to help you navigate that much easier. Okay, so again, just to wrap things up, when it comes to navigating, when it comes to using menus in Photoshop, keep the window drop-down menu firmly planted in the back of your head so you don't get lost. Of course, you can always email me if you do get lost. You can always ask me questions, but hopefully after looking at this, you've got a good understanding of how to tackle menu distribution and how to set up your work environment regardless of what version in Photoshop you happen to be working with. All right, we'll see you on the next tutorial.